they're all becoming syncretized with each other, they're all synonymizing with each other, they're all doing very similar things, and according to the way they've been understood by the Romans. And it was just a matter of choosing which one is going to be the one we're going to go with, and which one is going to become the Catholic version of this, the most universal version. And for them, having Jesus alayhi salam turned into this figure as the universal one made the most sense at the time, right?
Test the claim.
Or if you have a topic you want to talk about, even if it's like an Islamic one, you can use me as a foil. I can ask you questions or whatever. I'm happy to
I know we talked once about like how the Christian understanding of the meaning of the Messiah was heavily influenced by like Zoroastrian teachings.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you could maybe like elaborate on that a little bit, if that's okay.
I probably wouldn't characterize it as the Christian concept of Messiah specifically.
Sure.
But obviously the Christian concept is born out of the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
So the early Christians, as far as we know, were Jews who believed that Jesus was fulfilling a prophecy from the Jewish tradition, born out of the Jewish tradition, to such an extent that the expectation was that their savior figure would be from the line of David and fulfill a number of. I think the majority of the prophecies that they were expecting to have fulfilled are Talmudic, if I'm not mistaken. Although of course the Christians refer to the Old Testament.
But it's very vague passages. The ones when they kind of like imply more things than the Old Testament says about the Messiah. So like
my assumption is that they're drawing upon Talmudic teachings or some oral tradition. Yeah.
And also like so I think there's a book of Enoch. I can't remember what number it is, but it was written around the same time. So it was written around the same time or just before or after Isa alayhi salam, and it talks about
the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, and it kind of
the Book of Enoch is interesting actually in terms of its date of composition. Sorry to cut your progress, but often the claim that is made is that Enoch is an ancient book.
Yeah.
But your understanding is that it's written sometime.
I mean, I don't know which one. It's Enoch. I can try and find that out. Get the exact source. It's probably good. It's going to probably take a while, but
I like it when people bring books. I've got some books
hard,
as well.
Like bringing it in
Actually, you know what?
Stuff, right?
I've got a book that may be pertinent to this conversation, depending on how it goes. So while you look for that, let me go grab my bag.
For example, we have
I've had a few conversations about this recently, quite briefly. But
why don't we have a different conversation then, right? Because I don't.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean that I'm deterred from having the conversation. I mean, I've come prepared because of some conversations that have touched on this topic.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. I kind of wanted to explore the whole Indo-Aryan thing as well, but we can do that maybe another time.
No problem. Wherever the conversation goes is fine with me.
Probably gonna.
I'll talk a little bit about the Zoroastrian understanding of the kind of eschatological savior figure.
Sure.
And as I mentioned to you off camera, I defer to the teachings of Zarathustra.
Yeah.
There is a great deal of development of these ideas amongst the disciples and later sages of Zoroastrianism, but I am not a conventional Orthodox Zoroastrian. I limit myself to the teachings that are attributed to Zarathustra himself. So in the passages of the Gathas of Zarathustra, the hymns of Zarathustra, he alludes to the coming of a figure or figures, and I don't think it's limited to one, in the future. The word, the Avestan word that's used for this coming figure is Saoshyant.
Okay.
Saoshyant is usually translated as one who brings benefit. So it's one who is thought to bring benefit both to mankind and to the earth.
Okay.
From the wider teachings of Zarathustra, I come to understand that the Saoshyant are those from amongst mankind who transcend in terms of their moral quality. They kind of rise above and become beacons for the rest of mankind. They become an example for mankind.
Sure.
Although Zarathustra speaks heavily about the end of history, I don't think he limits himself to the idea of the Saoshyant being something that is specifically tied to that phase in time.
Okay.
However, he speaks about them coming in the future, and of course he does, because he is presenting this new ideology. So everything that is to come will proceed from it. So
Sure.
it's people in the future from his point in time.
So would you say, like, you know how the Eastern philosophies and, like, for example, Hinduism, Buddhism, I think Spengler talks about how they're very, Oswald Spengler, he mentions how they're very cyclical in their nature. So there's always birth and rebirth, and every moment in time always seems to have an equivalent moment in a previous cycle. So the concept of time was, as we understand it in the Abrahamic religions, and I guess what you're saying in Zoroastrianism, and in the West, right? And where we have a very linear view of time, where we can improve as people.
I wouldn't say in the West per se.
Okay.
I would say in the Indo-European tradition.
Okay.
Of which the Iranians are one branch.
Yeah.
There very much was a cyclical view of time in their worldview. So I don't just consider this an Eastern phenomenon, because yes, you find it in the Vedic world.
Vedic literature.
You also
Puranas
find
in the Vedas.
However, you also find it in Greek mythology.
So you're saying it stemmed from that Indo-Aryan civilization in the Caucasus, that
Indo-European society. I think this was like I think this particular concept, this concept of time, is something that was perhaps in the meta mythology, so to speak, the mythology of the Proto-Indo-European people before they expanded, and we see it reflected both in Greek mythology and in the Vedic tradition. And in fact, there are such stark parallels, such clear similarities. So, just in very general terms, the idea that history begins with a golden age and then declines into a silver age and a bronze age in an ever declining cycle, basically until things get so bad that humanity is begging for the gods to come and reign again.
Yeah.
And we see that both in the Vedic tradition or in modern Hinduism.
Yeah.
We also see it in Greek mythology. We even see parallels in the divinities, in the deities.
Okay.
The backstory of Zeus, the origin story, so to speak, is almost as clear parallels with Indra in the Hindu pantheon.
Okay.
They are. I would argue that they're so close that they are actually the same character whose mythology has just developed in these two separate cultures, which ultimately branched off from a single society.
So the expanding culture was one of the cyclical understanding, and you see Zarathustra as a form of like opposition towards that thinking and going against that teaching at the time.
So he teaches us the concept of a linear procession of time.
Yeah.
And he, as far as I'm aware, he is the first to discuss the idea of time, a teleological concept of time, meaning that time has a purpose. There is a reason for it to take the form that it does. So he talks about an end of time. He talks about the events that take place at the end of history, which would resonate very much with the later Jewish, so I mean Second Temple Jewish.
Yeah, post 70 AD.
No, Second Temple meaning from
Second Temple before the destruction. Yeah, so like pre
yeah, from
70
the from the construction of the Second Temple to the end to the destruction of it in 70 AD.
Sure.
The Christian concept, for example, of the resurrection of the flesh. I mean, it's core to Christian doctrine
And would you say like
and
the resurrection
Islam.
of the flesh? So on those first two, like the resurrection of the flesh and the influence on Judaism. So the influence on Judaism. Do you see a lot of this influence coming through the Babylonian exile?
I
Or
see.
is it even outside of that they were influenced?
I see significant influence on Jewish thinking during the Babylonian exile, meaning the infusion of Babylonian ideas into the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
And then around or from the point before the transition of power from the Babylonians to the Persians, I see the beginning of the transmission of Persian or Iranian ideas into the Jewish tradition.
And would you say the figure of Ezra?
I just want to give an example about Babylonian influence.
Sure.
So, for example, we find certain allusions in Jewish teachings to celestial phenomenon, astrology. There are some people in the park who come and talk about this actually in more detail. The Babylonians were the astrologers of that phase of the ancient world. And I feel like it's probably likely that those astrological ideas in Judaism were born out of contact with the astronomers or astrologers of Babylon. So they have concepts of the Mazzaroth, for example, which is a garland of constellations. And they developed the concept that the story of some divine story is written in the stars and gives us the ability to predict the coming of certain figures, for example. So there was the idea of the Star of David being a beacon or signal that the Messiah was coming. So there was a cult, shall we say, of people or following of people who believed that the coming of Jesus coincided with certain celestial movements. And this is also where we get the Magi incorporated into the book of Matthew, who came to confirm or deny whether the King of Kings had arrived as the star had predicted.
Okay.
I'm so sorry, I interrupted you to...
No, I was going to say, you were saying the...
I was giving you an example of Babylonian influence. Oh, you mentioned Ezra.
Ezra, and you know him being like that lawgiver kind of figure
Yeah,
in Judaism.
yeah.
And him being a figure during that Babylonian exile. Like, would he have...
That's how he's...
Would you see him as a sort of vehicle?
Well, that brings me to my books. So I've mentioned one of them on camera a couple of times.
Because,
Ezra and the Law by Elizabeth S. Freed. And then this book draws upon her work, as well as that of a few others, and it's called Persia and the Torah, the theory of imperial authorization of the Pentateuch. And this book in particular expands on some of the ideas of Elizabeth Freed in terms of the theory that the Torah as we know it, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, may not only would have been authorized by a Persian king, specifically Artaxerxes, but to the extent to which it may have been originally authored by Ezra or heavily edited by, and where the contents of the 5 books of Moses, the sources that it draws upon. So it's not suggesting, for example, that it's a work of Persian morality packaged up for the Jews, but actually it suggests that much of it may have been drawn from Egyptian, earlier Egyptian works, but authorized by the Persian court.
But why would they do this for a foreign culture? Like, why would they try and create this creation narrative and, cultural narrative and go through all this effort for a foreign culture, and then just for that foreign culture to adopt it. I'm definitely agreeing with you in the fact that, like, even in the Quran, it mentions the Jews took Ezra as the son of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the
Right.
Christians took, Isa alayhi salam as the son of Allah
Right,
subhanahu wa
right.
ta'ala. And there is some understanding in
Where
the
does
way
that, that Islamic understanding, where does that appear?
it's in the Quran. So it's Surah Tawbah, ayah 30.
Right.
So it says, the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while the Christians...
What's the Arabic name for Ezra?
Uzair, I think.
Uzair, okay.
So it's most identified with Ezra, but like with some of these biblical prophets, when it's referred to in the Islamic tradition, it's sometimes not like 100% per se, but
Sure.
Yes,
Yeah, I understand.
Ezra Ezra is seen as like a law-giving figure, right, in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So we consider him a prophet,
Yeah.
of course, but it's very interesting, like how.
But it views him with.
But it's very interesting how, like, there is that the Quran and the Islamic tradition recognizes the significance of the figure of Ezra in the Jewish tradition, and I think you're coming from a very similar point. Not perhaps like completely agreeing with me, but you see Ezra as a very defining figure for Jews in the Old Testament and in the Talmud.
If one takes the most invasive theory, so there are a number of theories. Even Jews would accept that Ezra was key in teaching the law when he returned to the Holy Land. Even Jews consider him in high regard, obviously. I tend to believe, from what I've read so far, that he hadn't been in possession of a Torah scroll.
Okay.
And in fact, all the remaining Torah scrolls seem absent. There don't seem to be any. There is so there are a number of books. There are a couple of books in the Old Testament that mention Ezra, namely the eponymous books, the Book of Ezra. I believe he's also mentioned in Nehemiah. He's also mentioned in the books of Esdras, which is the Greek rendition of Ezra, but they are considered later authorship and apocryphal. I think it's I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's the Ethiopian church that still considers them canonical.
As one of the extra books that they have.
Yeah. And in it, you find a story of Ezra.
Sorry, what book was this?
Esdras.
Esdras.
Yeah, Esdras. And I think there are one or two.
Okay.
There's like one Esdras and two Esdras.
Yeah. Sure.
And they refer to his lamentations that he wasn't in possession of the law when he was instructed to go and teach it back in the Holy Land. So then he's described as removing himself from the people, going into isolation with a number of his scribes, and then coming under the inspiration of God, and then the Torah coming forth in this isolation.
Okay.
Which kind of opens the door to the idea that it's kind of a tacit admission that it was being written then, but opens the door to it being authored then also. That being said, my understanding is also that there are significant parts of the Torah we have today which are old.
Pre-Ezra.
Pre-Ezra.
Like
Pre-Ezra.
And stuff. That's
No.
Okay.
No. Interestingly, the Book of Job appears Second Temple.
Okay.
So it's quite interesting, but you've got to know. So Book of Job, no, but there are significant parts of the Pentateuch that are old, and then there are parts that appear to be newly, kind of freshly inserted. So, for example, there are kind of two creation myths in the Book of Genesis. and it's been described that they appear to have been added later, or edited, or heavily redacted at a later point in time.
Okay.
So Ezra is pivotal in this idea that the Torah has been edited or changed, or a later work entirely. I don't think it's a later work entirely.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because that very high recognition in the Quran of the preeminence of Ezra in the Jewish tradition, and how they've elevated him above, like how they've done with Isa alayhi salam. They've taken him to a level above what his duty and task was for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They've kind of
what does that make you think when you see the Quran alluding to this?
Yeah, I mean, I see in terms of, I don't like to comment too much on my own personal thing, but I have heard in terms of,
I think as long as you're clear which parts are your personal views and
so
which
I've
parts.
heard a tradition where Ezra, for example, him being a lawgiver, right? He that also ties into the way the Persian tradition. So the Persian tradition is a very bureaucratic system. They were very good at keeping laws, very good at structuring society in that way, and that kind of influence on Judaism. Ezra bringing a form of that through like the authorship and kind of like tidying up the religion of Judaism, right?
Yeah.
And then
or
the Jewish
codifying it in a way.
Yeah. And the Jewish tradition taking that to the extreme in the way that they developed that later with the Talmud. So that's kind of how I've naturally seen it. I've never like delved into it too much, but I see that elevation of Ezra as alluding to that. There are other understandings as well. Like there was, I believe there might have been I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe there might have been a tribe in like Yemen or South Arabia which elevated Ezra beyond what's normal.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can also see this understanding play out as well, the one I described.
It's interesting that you put it that I suppose that we put it that way, like with I interjected with the word codifying, but you agreed that it was a somewhat suitable way of describing his effect on the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, not on the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in terms of like structuring the Jewish tradition, I do feel I've read some things about that and the fact that he organized it in a really...
No, but I find it interesting because, and this might be controversial for a Muslim audience, but if we concede that Ezra was played a role, obviously being a governor of the Persian court, a Jewish governor of the Persian court, if we see Ezra as having been important in playing a role for creating this order, creating this codification of what had been the ancient Israelite religion, and then kind of molding it into what we understand as Judaism today. Again, like maybe somewhat controversially, I see the Persians playing a similar role with Islam, in terms of the importance of Persian thought in developing hadith science, for example.
Just on the previous point, you kind of see what I'm alluding to there, right? And I feel like you're somewhat in agreement with the Quranic position. You take a more hard stance on like Ezra had a lot more influence on the Jewish tradition.
So the Quranic stance is that Ezra has been elevated perhaps to a station of which, like, by the people, he's been given license to elevate himself, or he's been elevated.
All the teachings he came with have been elevated and taken to an extreme in a degree. So maybe like that's what my.
I'd be happy to have a look at the passages.
In terms of like the Talmudic tradition and all that developing later, and the codification going to like an extreme point. The Jewish tradition later.
And you mean maybe losing its essence
and losing its
in
essence,
that process?
Exactly.
Right.
So that is an interpretation I've heard of that specific passage in Surah Tawbah.
Surah Tawbah. Okay. Let me remind me of the verses.
30.
I don't know which chapter that is. Do you know the chapter number?
Yeah, Surah 9.
Oh yeah. Chapter verse 30, you said?
Yeah, that's 30.
I don't know how reliable my
And
translation
in terms
is.
of like, I think you're maybe going to start directing this towards the hadith, right? And the when we're talking about later, in terms of like the Persian influence on Islam, and are you kind of coming at it from the angle of the hadith, or are you talking about even earlier in terms of like?
I think that I have no idea when my camera stopped recording. We've had a little dead battery timeout, but we're back. We'll pick up where we left off, but I don't know whether you might have missed something already or not. So, yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Does it not demonstrate a more cyclical approach to things? The fact that this thing keeps happening, this, in my mind at least, yeah, in my mind. So,
Sorry, I'm just listening. I'm saying straight.
Zarathustra, hand in hand with this linear concept of time, Zarathustra talks about the progressive mentality,
Okay.
finding better and new ways to do things.
Yeah.
And it seems contradictory to that teaching to keep doing the same thing. And in this instance, it's my claim that they keep tinkering with other people's religious traditions.
Sorry, repeat that bit.
So it may seem contradictory to the idea of A, of the linear progression of time, and B, with the progressive mentality expounded by Zarathustra, where he tells us, look, if you find new ways of doing, better ways of doing things, change your ways. And that seems contradictory to the idea that the Persians, in my mind, are repeatedly meddling in the religious traditions of other people. But although, yes, we can find new ways of doing things, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And this seems to have, I think this seems to have served an end, served a purpose. This method seems to have served a purpose for the Persian people. Interestingly enough, I think it's the preservation of their way of thinking that led them to do this type of thing. So where they encountered a malleable religious tradition, which potentially posed a threat or offered, gave them a means to an end. So for example, in the reformation of the Jewish tradition, they were bringing somewhat under control a people who served as a gateway to their imperial expansionist ambitions, because the ambitions of Cyrus the Great were to conquer Egypt.
Yeah, go to go westwards.
And so Judea
Was a bridge
is
to-
arguably the gateway
Yeah,
to North Africa.
sure.
And yeah, and I see this as,
And so you're saying like, even I'm going to bring in Siddhartha Buddha,
yeah,
the figure Buddha. So he's also dealing with the cyclical tradition, and he comes at it from a very different approach to Zarathustra, who's coming to this cyclical tradition. So the Buddha kind of like teaches to,
you're not going to like my answer to this.
okay, he's teaching to kind of separate yourself from the cycle, right? The only way
Right.
to release yourself from the suffering of the cycles that is taught in Eastern philosophy is to reach a state of nirvana, which is to just exit the whole system,
Yeah.
right? You're saying Zarathustra is trying to push a new, improved version of dealing with those cycles. As in, don't
Yeah.
just laissez-faire, let the cycles happen. Rather, have the cycles happen, but try and make each cycle.
Yeah, my phone. Do you mind? If you don't mind, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, like, have each cycle happen, but try and make each cycle better than the other.
Right.
Is that where you're kind of coming from? Or
No.
it's okay.
No. This idea of time is a cosmic issue.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that a similar thing can't happen. Let's say today, a thing can't happen today, and then in a couple of hundred years, a similar thing can't happen. That's they're still taking place along that linear
Sure.
historical pathway. I have a whole very controversial view on the origins of Buddhism.
Okay. I think we talked about it last time. So it's about it being related to the Buddha being a figure in Sassanid.
No, a Achaemenid.
Achaemenid, yes.
Yeah.
Achaemenids.
Yeah.
Sassanids are way
Because
after,
he
right?
was like end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century BCE.
Sure. So I'm saying it's very interesting. Like, there's these two figures, Zarathustra and the Buddha.
Yeah.
And they're coming at this Indo-Aryan way of dealing with things.
Yeah.
That dates back to the Proto-Indo-Aryans, which is very cyclical. I proposed to you before, like the Chaldeans.
The
Chaldeans.
Yeah.
Chaldeans.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, the Parthians. The Parthians were very. They were quite, in terms of like the Persian region, they were quite. They weren't as enforcing of the religion of Zoroastrianism as the other Persian.
I don't think they were. I don't think they were
They weren't
Zoroastrians.
Zoroastrians. Okay.
I think they were Mithraists.
Mithras. Okay.
But I think they were sympathetic to Zoroastrianism because soon after the time of Zarathustra, Mithras was incorporated into Zoroastrianism. He was presented as the savior figure, the mediator.
Sure.
Zarathustra never mentions Mithras. He was, I think, he was moving away from that
Kind of thinking.
existing Indo-Iranian landscape of divinities. I won't go as far as calling Mithras a god, although he is considered a deity in the Vedic world.
But I was saying, could like the Parthians were very, they were a lot more tolerant of minority religions compared to other Persian religions, other Persian empires that were very enforcing of the religion of Zoroastrianism.
I disagree.
And they allowed Buddhist monks to come in. So could you not see the figure of Zarathustra being influenced by?
I disagree that the
So
Parthians
you're saying it's the other way around?
were more tolerant.
Okay, why?
Okay, you're aware of the presence of the cult of Mithras in the Roman world.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that I see the Persian world as being responsible for a series of influential having an influential role on a number of religious traditions. I include that in the Roman religious tradition because the presence of Mithras in the Roman world is a direct result of Parthian intervention. It was part of their policy to have, not by accident, it was part of their policy to have Mithraic religious beliefs transmitted into the Roman world. So, for example, we have reports of them using...
As a form of subversion.
Pardon me?
As a form of like subversion, of like...
Yeah, so, as a form of psychosocial engineering. Yeah, subversion, if you want to call it that.
And is this where Christianity won out in comparison to Mithraism, because the Roman Empire recognized the Persian Empire as having...
I'll give a brief history as I know it.
Yeah.
The Parthians enlisted the help of a special operations navy, for want of a better phrase. The Cilician pirates. So Cilicia is on the southern coast of Anatolia at the time, and these pirates, who are most famous probably for having taken Julius Caesar captive and having won a handsome reward for him, although he took revenge on them at some point, or so the story says, at some point. They were hired to transmit Mithraic religious teachings into the Roman world through the Roman port towns of the Mediterranean.
Sure. Okay.
So these were the port towns that were also the home of many of the elite Roman families.
I'll let you finish, sorry. Yeah, I was going to come in, but I'll let you finish.
It was this process, as well as the migration of a labor force from east to west, bringing these traditions with them also, that ended up with Mithraism being arguably the world's most powerful religion at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
We see influences from in Japan today.
Okay.
We see the temples of Mithras at Hadrian's Wall in London, at the London Mithraeum.
Yeah.
At Hadrian's Wall, there's at least 2 Mithraea.
Yeah. And would you say the secretive nature of Mithraism stemmed from it always being this Persian thing entering the rival kingdom, and that possibly being a reason for why Mithraism was such a secretive, elitist religion in the Roman Empire?
That may be true.
Yeah.
We have very little access to Mithraic liturgies, to writings or anything. Primarily because it was a mystery religion or a mystery cult.
Yeah.
It was not something that was discussed in public. It was not something the worship did not take place in a public arena, to such an extent that actually worship was conducted in subterranean temples. And with the rise of Christianity, churches were built often on top of Mithraic temples.
I mean, I really want to go down this line of.
So when you say the Parthians were more tolerant, they weren't. They were saying, take our ideas and flood the Roman world with our ideas.
Maybe they weren't tolerant towards the Western kingdoms, but I feel towards the Eastern kingdoms of their empire, they were a lot more tolerant.
Okay.
As in, they allowed Buddhist monks to come in and proselytize their people.
I would
feel
argue
like this would have had also an influence on the Zoroastrian religion.
That may be the case, but it would be an influence on later Zoroastrianism, because even in Achaemenid, I mean, the Parthians come some 200 years after the end of the Achaemenids, but by then Zoroastrianism is already 1300 years old. The teachings of Zarathustra are already 1300 years old.
Sure. Okay.
But I mean, it could. I don't know. I wouldn't bet my house on it. But the Parthians were probably related to the Eastern Iranian peoples. So the Parthians, as we know them, as we look back today, were based in what is the northern part of modern Iran.
Okay.
Around the southern coast of the Caspian Sea.
So it's kind of like, it kind of mirrors the Safavid invasions later on. As in,
what
like,
mirrors
them coming from Azerbaijani area.
Yeah, well, the Turkic invasions would have been from the north. The Parthians happened to be from the north, but they were from. They are. I don't want to make a silly mistake. I think they are thought of as having been of Scythian stock.
Okay, yeah.
Now, some recent research suggests that Gautama Buddha may also have been of Scythian stock.
I think we talked about that.
Yeah, from the Saka people.
Saka people.
So Scythian, from a Iranian linguistic perspective, is Saka.
Yeah.
So Sistan, the province of Sistan and Balochistan, Sistan is a contraction of Sakastan or Sakastana. So in a book called The Buddha from Babylon, Harvey Kraft gives it's like an 800-page study into the idea that Gautama Buddha was from a family of Scythian nobility, who were part of the Persian court, and who he himself eventually became the high priest of the Esagila temple in Babylon.
Yeah, I don't really buy that, but yeah.
Sure. Like I say, it's 800 pounds. No, but it's interesting because he approaches this from a multidisciplinary perspective. He looks at not only archaeological evidence, meaning he refers to clay seals that bear the crest of the Siddhartha family.
Yeah.
He identifies the family as being part of the Persian nobility. These seals are found in the Hall of Records in Persepolis.
Okay.
And he identifies a prominent villain, shall we say, from the perspective of Darius the Great, in one of the most famous sort of Persian Achaemenid dramas, so to speak. If anyone who's familiar with Persian history, the figure of Gaumata is thought to be Gautama, and they're perfectly aligned, temporally, like in time.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'll give you the book. It's fascinating. Excuse me. So he not only does he look at the archaeological evidence, he also does what he calls spiritual excavation. He is a Buddhist of some 30 years.
Sure.
He studies whether the teachings of Gautama Buddha may actually have been born out of a critique, or whether they show contact with Zoroastrian teachings. So, but maybe that's a conversation for
that's really interesting. This high between Zoroastrianism and but I was just wondering. I probably have to head off in a bit.
No
but
problem.
I thought it was really interesting the line we're going down with Mithraism.
Yeah.
And them being a secret society.
Yeah.
Possibly like stemming to secret societies that exist today. And
I would say that the Roman Catholic Church just changed its name, like as in just changed its figurehead, but didn't change its religion. The Roman Catholic Church,
imperial household,
symbolically, as in I would argue 90% of the symbols of Roman Catholicism are Mithraic, but they've just been attributed nominally to Jesus.
Yeah. So isn't there the very early on the depictions of Mithra where he would like carry a sheep on his back?
You asked me about this. I always felt like that was Apollo, but Mithras is
Mithra and
syncretized with Apollo.
With Apollo, and I'm saying there was a discovery of like an artifact of Jesus, like as depicted by the Romans in like the first 300 years after his death. And he was carrying like a sheep on his back in a very similar way to the figure of Apollo, in a very similar way to the figure of Mithra. I just find it really interesting, like that there was this kind of tension between Mithraism, which was, as you mentioned, a religion of the elites in the Roman Empire, and the religion of Christianity, which is also a popular religion in the empire, as in who is going to win out as the religion for the Roman Empire.
From a military perspective, Mithraism was the religion of the officers, and Christianity was the religion of the infantry.
But the infantry, didn't they celebrate Christmas in a way? Like Mithra's birthday is Christmas, right? Like
yes,
25th December to 67.
the winter solstice.
The winter solstice. So Mithra's birthday was a popular celebration by the Mithraic infantry.
Yeah.
So why was it just the officers you're saying that were Mithraic, or like even the infantry?
Not exclusively. I think if we were painting very broad strokes, then
it would have been a more military kind of.
But that being said. And we find this in other sort of more modern, in our modern concept of secret societies. It's kind of it kind of levels the playing field. You can find someone who adopts a very high status in their everyday life, being subordinate to someone who in their ordinary life would be far inferior to them. So someone could be cleaning your shoes out in public, but be your superior in the temple of Mithras. And one would ascend through a series of rituals or rites.
Handshakes and stuff.
Handshakes and salutes. And, interestingly, ashen crosses on the forehead.
And with Mithraism, right? So you're saying it was always some element in the Roman Empire that was worried that this is some kind of subversion or some influence from the Persian Empire.
It was explicitly called the Persian god.
It's explicitly so, like in the Roman Empire, there's this figure of the Roman god that's becoming synonymized with the figure of Apollo.
Right.
And I agree with that. And I feel the reason Christianity won out in the
Sol
end.
Invictus.
And Sol Invictus. The reason Christianity won out in the end is because that wasn't a foreign god to the Roman Empire. It was a foreign god, but not in the way that the Persian Empire is to. Like it was a foreign god to a subordinate people. So the Jewish people were subordinate,
who lived in some harmless backwater of the Roman Empire.
They saw them as backwards.
Right. Whereas Mithras is seen as the god of the rival.
A real rival. So they would rather worship the god of a subordinate people than the god of the opposing empire.
If you think, on a spiritual level, the bulk of your population is worshipping the god of your rival, this would present an incredible national security risk.
Yeah.
Because it means your people on a spiritual level are sympathetic with the enemy.
Yeah.
Oh, we worship the same God. And that opens the door to, probably in the mind of Constantine, an incredible threat to Rome's security.
Yeah.
And it was incumbent on him, I suppose, to close that trapdoor and adopt a new figurehead for their universal religion, which ultimately became the figurehead of the Roman Empire. But the Pope still wears the hat named after Mithras, the mitre. The symbols are all there.
And so, what's the relationship between Sol Invictus and Mithra? Sol Invictus is like a alternative, is it a more futurized version of Apollo, right? Because Apollo was the Greek god.
Yeah.
Sol Invictus was that Greek god developed
the unconquered sun.
Into the Roman kind of version. There's this there's these three figures: Jesus, as according to the Christians; Apollo, this ancient Greek god; Sol Invictus, this Roman version of that Greek god; and four gods: Mithra. Mm-hmm. They're all becoming syncretized with each other. They're all synonymizing with each other. They're all doing very similar things, and according to the way they've been understood by the Romans. And it was just a matter of choosing which one is going to be the one we're going to go with, and which one is going to become the Catholic version of this, the most universal version.
Yeah.
And for them, having Jesus alayhi salam turned into this figure as the universal one made the most sense at the time, right? Because they had the threat from the Jewish people.
The least threatening, yeah.
They had the threat. It was for internal security and stability.
Yeah.
It made the most sense to make Jesus that figure because it would pacify. They
could even argue that he was a Roman in some.
Yeah, they could even twist it in that way.
Yeah.
But it would pacify the Jewish people, according to them, if they could try and make them into this pacified version of their religion, which is Christianity. Mm-hmm. It would not be a foreign enemy god like Mithra. It would kind of universalize Apollo and Sol Invictus, because Apollo and Sol Invictus are very Greek Roman gods, and they wanted a wider god for their empire to kind of universalize their religion. So it makes complete sense, yeah.
Sol Invictus is obviously a solar deity.
Yeah.
Mithras actually at his core is not the sun. Mithras is the herald of the sun.
Okay.
He precedes the sun, which is dangerous in a way because it also then conjures images of the light bringer.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mithras we are conjured images of Mithras traversing the sky in his solar chariot in advance of the sun, and that's where we get things like the military salute, with shielding our eyes. In this rite of ascension in the cult of Mithras, one would shield his eyes from the radiance emanating from Mithras' solar chariot. And we see quite a bit of such imagery even in like modern militaria.
Even
like
Statue of Liberty, right, where she's like holding the torch and she's an androgynous figure like Mithra.
Yeah.
And the way it's very interesting also, like the way all four of these figures we're talking about, there's been an element of androgenization of them by
Jesus?
by the Romans. Yeah, in a way they've androgenized him in a way that they've taken away the man aspect of him, like the fact that he was a man.
Oh, you mean in terms of like taking away his, like he didn't marry, he didn't undertake relations with women.
Way,
yeah, that's I've never looked at it from that perspective, but that may be. Well, certainly the androgyny of Mithras. So you can even look back in terms of like Persian culture. Mitra, the Persian rendering of Mithras.
Yeah.
We also have a second name for Mitra, which is Mehr.
Okay.
And Mitra is a woman's name.
Yeah.
Mehr is a kind of unisex prefix to either a man or a woman's name.
Sure.
one of the rites of ascension in the cult of Mithras is called the rite of the nymphus, or also known as the rite of the bridegroom, where a male adherent, because all Mithraists ostensibly were men, he would play the role of the bride. So a man would wear a woman's gown, and images of Mithras, in the images of Mithras, we see him wearing a crescent diadem, so like a tiara.
We also see that syncretized with Jesus alayhi salam, like where they depict him with the crown of thorns.
Yeah, that's one way. That may be one way of looking at it. So we see Mithras wearing the tiara, which emanates rays of the sun, which we also see in Sol Invictus. Also in the Tauroctony scene, which is the most famous rendition of Mithras, where he's kind of he looks like he's riding the bull, and he's plunging his dagger into the back of the bull and looking away. We see this as an astrological image. It's bringing about the end of the age of Taurus. However, in this image, we also see the two like cherub-type figures holding aloft torches. So in the Statue of Liberty, we see what looks like a woman, but may actually just be an androgynous male wearing something like a wedding gown, with the crescent diadem emitting rays of the sun, holding a torch.
Okay.
And it's said that with the emergence of Christianity in the Roman world, Mithraism went even further underground, ultimately playing an important role in other secret societies that have made their way even through to the modern day. The creator of the Statue of Liberty, Bartholdi, was a Freemason. And it may well be that he was quite consciously rendering Mithras. So it's not the Statue of Liberty, it's the Statue of Mithras.
Good to see you. Good to see you, man. How you doing?
You well?
Yeah, all good.
Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries.
How's things with
You too. Nice to see you. Will do.
You've got my contact details, right?
I'm not sure. Oh, thank you.
You got a business
You
card
definitely
now?
got my contact details.
Yeah, of course, man. It's okay.
I'm going to look into that Islamic viewing of Ezra. And then I'm going to build one of my theories around it.
It's really fascinating, right? Like these figures, and yeah, I mean, I know. You said like you don't want to combat it from an Abrahamic angle, but like if you look at, and I'm sure you've developed similar points about Islam, which I think we addressed a few times, about like the Parthians and them in the Battle of Badr, and stuff, which you talked about, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Hopefully debunked.
But I'll make it on camera one day.
Yeah. I like we can do it now. So, but I mean, but in terms of like, it's very interesting that Islam calls out like Ezra, peace be upon him, and Jesus, peace be upon him.
You're not going to like what I say.
Okay, fine, we won't get it. But in terms of what you said about, I mean,
no, but
I don't want to bring in that.
Who would have not?
Argument,
Okay,
but,
I'd say there are two people or institutions that could have joined the dots there. Either God, or the people who did it in the first place. The people who...
This sounds like a conspiracy.
Yeah, the people who were responsible for putting Ezra in that position.
Okay.
Which was the Persians. I think if there was... Okay, again, as someone who doesn't believe, we are often given this, what I feel is a fallacious, false dilemma, which is, well, how could a man in 6th, 7th century, middle of the desert Arabia, have had this information?
Yeah.
And the false dilemma that we're given is either that he knowingly lied, or there's a few options that we're given.
Sure.
But I think there's potentially much more behind it. I see it as a work of man. And then but your next question has to be, which men would have been equipped in that time to have created something like this?
Talking about Islam.
I'm talking about Islam, the Quran.
Yeah, but I'm saying Islam is just so beautiful in the way that it spawned in a region of the world that's kind of still in a way in classical antiquity, right? I mean, in a lot of ways compared to late antiquity. So, it's like the Sassanids, the Romans, they've developed all of this military infrastructure. They developed all of these systems.
Right.
And Arabia, they've always considered a backwater. In terms of like
battle zone,
backwater.
Oh, backwater.
Where
Yeah.
they're just like playing these
proxy wars, just untamable.
Where they're just playing these proxy wars, and it's little's understood and everything. And if you look, like we talked a little bit about the Indo-Aryan languages, right? And if you look at Semitic languages, Arabic has a very special place amongst the Semitic languages.
Uh-huh.
And I mentioned Oswald Spengler a bit earlier. He's a controversial figure, but he's like a German philosopher, and he talks about how he looks at the world civilizations he talks about how he sees the world civilization. So the Indian civilization, he sees it as a very cyclical civilization, like we talked about. You have the ancient Greek civilization, which was also, interestingly, he mentions it very similar to the Indian civilization, like you said. So, credit on you. He said it's a very cyclical civilization in the way the Greek gods were, because they kind of stem from the same tradition, right? The Proto-Indo-Aryan peoples.
They have the same grandmother.
One went towards Europe and killed everyone. The Yamnaya people, which was a mass genocide against the indigenous European people. And that's why the only languages we have today, apart from Finnish, some minor European languages, the majority Basque and stuff as well. The majority of European languages are Indo-European languages because of that genocide. When they went towards India, they integrated with the people, but they created a form of caste system which developed the religion of Hinduism. And what you're saying,
and of course, the word Arya means the noble or nobility in some respect, right?
Sorry, I forgot my point. What was the point I was trying to make?
You're talking about Spengler.
So he sees the modern Western tradition that was like after ancient Greece. He sees it as a completely different civilization, not even spawned. You know how in the West people see, we go back to the Greeks, as in like we are a tradition from that time. He sees it as a completely distinct civilization, and he calls it the Faustian civilization.
Right.
After Faust, the German guy who, just for the cameras, he sold his soul to the devil in order to achieve materialistic.
So we get the Faustian deal.
Yeah. So he sees the European civilization as that, and he sees Christianity as having
bought into what?
Having bought into.
So the Europeans,
having been bought into like unlimited. He also kind of has a very interesting way of looking at civilization. So he sees the Chinese civilization as a garden with like various pathways you can walk down, and he sees that as representative of their culture.
But you said the Western worldview.
He sees the Western worldview.
You say it's not related. You don't see like a natural evolution of that worldview.
No.
It's something that they bought into.
It's something completely distinct from the ancient.
That's just been overlaid onto.
It's just separate. It's like the ancient classical world was destroyed.
But where does that? What is that worldview? Where does it come from? Is it not the Judeo-Christian?
No.
Greek.
So this is the interesting. So he sees the Middle Eastern region, the Magian civilization. He sees Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as having the same core essence.
Right.
So he identifies Christianity with the Magian civilization. With the Middle Eastern civilization. Sorry, I don't know why I said Magian, but maybe he does use the word Magian. I'm not sure.
Magian.
I'm not sure if he uses the word Magian, but the Middle Eastern civilization.
Why would he use the word Magian?
Maybe I'm making a mistake because we were talking about Magians before.
Okay.
I'll see if you. But I can double check after. But whatever civilization, the Middle Eastern civilization, he sees Christianity, Judaism, and Islam being from that civilization.
Right.
And he sees the major. It's very interesting because the way he talks about it.
We have to separate ourselves from Western Christianity, right?
He's talking about the what I see as the early true Christianity. You probably do as well. Like he sees that as being of the same essence as Judaism and Islam, and being from this Middle Eastern area. He sees that this Middle Eastern, I'm going to say Magian because I think that's what he used.
Okay.
This Magian civilization. How I said
that. Magian, in an Arabic context, would be Majus, right?
Majus.
Right.
I don't know. I don't want to.
But I'd like to confirm.
He sees that, like I said, he sees it, these civilizations as representative of buildings. He sees that as a dome.
Okay.
And he sees it as this civilization in comparison to the two Western ones I mentioned, in comparison to the Indian one, the Chinese civilization, which he talks about. The Russian civilization, for some reason, he distinguishes that from the European one, and he sees that as a flat plane. He sees that as the most recent of these civilizations, and he sees that developing further in the future. But in terms of the Middle Eastern civilization, he sees that as having always been suppressed by its foreign occupiers. So he sees the Persian influence and the Roman influence and all of these influences always having suppressed the true nature of this civilization.
Okay.
And he sees Islam as a bursting of the true essence of this Middle Eastern civilization.
But before the Persians,
Yeah.
let's say if I was to agree that the Persians were an oppressing force,
Yeah.
before that it would have been the Babylonians. No, thank you very much. No, thank you. Sorry, just come this side because the camera's behind you. It would have been the Babylonians, the Assyrians, but these were all Semitic people. Anyway, let's wrap up.
I'm going to wrap up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's always fascinating
with
with you. Thank you so much.
It was really interesting touching on all those topics.
Yeah. And stop recording. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button.